Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the first in our series of critical conversations this year at Mildert College. I want to start by saying a quick thank you to everybody who was part of the steering group for critical conversations this year and has put together a superb programme of talks. This is the first of 4. The next one is going to be called Do We Live in a Democracy? After Christmas, we have 2 more, one called What is Porn Doing to Us? And one called Should We Be Scared of AI? So I hope that many of you will come along and join us on those occasions as well. Tonight, our topic is class still destiny? And I'm sure that we're going to have an interesting conversation. Let me start by saying something quickly about the format of these events before I introduce our speakers. This isn't a debate. There's no motion, there are no sides, there's no vote, nobody wins. The aim, rather, is for us to have an open, civil conversation about this topic, with the aim of people leaving the room thinking about this topic in more nuanced, sophisticated, and interesting ways than they did when they arrived. If you feel that you've left thinking about this topic in more interesting ways than you did when you arrived, then we have achieved our aim this evening. And so what we're going to do is ask our 3 speakers to introduce the topic for just a few minutes each, and then we open the floor to discussion. And what I hope is that our speakers will have a chance to discuss this with each other, that they'll have a chance to talk to you about it, and that you will have a chance to talk to one another about it as well. We are capturing tonight's proceedings on video, and we'll be sharing that more widely so that other people can get involved in the discussion. In order to facilitate that, we're going to have a roving microphone when it comes to questions. The microphone isn't there to amplify your voice, so please speak loudly. It's just there to capture audio for the recording. So, let me introduce our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Vicky Bolivar. Vicky joined the Department of Sociology at Durham in 2011, and she teaches across the curriculum there and is co-convener of Durham University's First Generation Scholars Network. Her research focuses on social inequalities of access to the world's most prestigious universities. After that, we're going to hear from David Byrne. David is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Sociology and a Fellow in the Durham Research Methods Centre, as well as an associate member of CHESS, the Centre for Humanities Engaging Science and Society. He's currently writing a book about complexity in social science, and he continues to work with various community groups, particularly in the Scottish Borders and in Tyneside. And finally, it is our aim always to include a student voice on our panels at these events. And so our 3rd speaker is Lindsay Curry. Lindsay is a second-year undergraduate student here at Van Mildert, studying for a BA in Business and Management. And she's a local student living in Usher Moor, County Durham. So welcome to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight and sharing your thoughts on this topic. And I'm going to ask Vicky to start off with her opening words.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Can you hear me all right with this microphone? All right. I thought I'd start by getting a sense of who's in the room tonight. So let me see your hand if you think of yourself as middle class. Lovely. Welcome. How about those of us who feel that they're working class? Yeah. It's always nice to be in a socially mixed setting. I often feel like I'm in a socially mixed setting even when I'm on my own, because I'm what sociologists would call upwardly socially mobile. So I'm from a working class family. I'm now unequivocally middle class in many respects. It's a bit of an unusual, psychologically unusual position to be in, but definitely working class by origin. My dad was a postman. Both my parents left school at 15 to go to work and to start a family. I was raised on a council estate in Birmingham. I went to the local school. It was one of those schools known as a sink school, where about a third managed to get out, scraping 5 or more GCSEs. No sixth form. Most of us, including myself, just went to work in low-paid, low-skilled jobs at 15. Somehow I wound up back in education. I went to night school, did a couple of A-levels. At that point realised that people from my background could go to university. I'm embarrassed to admit it now, but my perception of university prior to then was a kind of brideshead revisited sort of idea of university. I really thought university was for extremely posh people and that they all wore tuxedos all day and spent most of the time punting. So it was a bit of a revelation to me to realise that like 19, actually universities aren't quite like that, and I could go if I wanted to. So I got a bachelor's degree in sociology at Leicester, got a master's at Cambridge, got a PhD at Oxford, don't really know how that happened, and then started to climb the greasy pole of academia to the rank of professor. And in fact, it was Dave Byrne who appointed me 10 years ago to my lectureship at Durham, so thank you, Dave, for assisting my upward social mobility. Now, I mention this because the topic is class destiny. Clearly, for me, in the sort of objective sense of class, my class origin was not my class destiny. My education and my occupation and my income definitely place me in the middle class nowadays. Subjectively, it's a rather different matter, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But I thought, as a quantitative social scientist who's interested in matters of access to higher education and social mobility, I'd give you some statistics that give you a sense of how common it is to be upwardly mobile, and by contrast, how common is it to move up the class structure versus being able to stay there if you were born at the top. So I'll just briefly say something about higher education first. If you think about rates of going to university, for working class people nowadays, it's about 1 in 3 go to university. So it's not an insubstantial proportion who go to uni. For middle class people, though, it's 2 out of 3, so you're twice as likely to go to uni if you're middle class than working class. The same goes for if your parents were university graduates versus not, you're twice as likely to go to uni. The figures get more disparate if you think specifically about the most privileged middle class people, let's say those who use private fee-paying schools. And if you think about the most elite forms of higher education, like, I don't know, coming to Durham University, for example. So some of you will know that Durham University is famous or perhaps infamous for having the most privately educated undergraduates in its population. I think it's about 40% come from private schools, compared to about 7% of all young people nationally. So statistically speaking, there are about 5.5 times more privately educated undergrads at Durham than you would expect if class wasn't destiny, if your class background didn't affect your likelihood of going to a prestigious institution like this one. So we could also look at occupational social mobility. What are the chances that people will end up in an occupational class position that's different to that of their parents? It depends a bit on how you measure occupational class and how many classes you use. If we use the government's kind of preferred classification schema, where there are about 7 classes, then about 60% of people will end up in an occupational class that's different from that of their parents. So that sounds like there's quite a lot of social mobility in society. One thing you have to bear in mind, though, is that a lot of this mobility between origin and destination is pretty short range. So it's people moving up 1 grade out of 7, maybe 2, possibly moving down, or that's much less common to move down the class structure than to move up it. If you think of the top occupational social class as being those higher managerial and professional occupations, things like doctors, lawyers, CEOs, if you think of them as the top class, and then if you think of the bottom occupational social class as being those really low-paid, low-skilled, precarious jobs, like the person who does your delivery on a Friday night or picks the things out of the Amazon warehouse for you. If you think of that as the bottom social class, then your chances of ending up in the top class rather than the bottom class are about 20 times better if your family was from that top class rather than the bottom class. So I would say, is class destiny? Not exactly, but as sociologists would put it, we're very far from having a society in which there's perfect social mobility, that is to say, in which there's no predictive power of your class origins on where you'll end up educationally or occupationally. I just wanted to throw in one more thing that's less statistical, just to open up this conversation a little bit, and that is to say, even though I've spent 20 years now looking at social mobility rates and rates of access to higher education and very much coming at this question from a sort of social mobility lens, I think it's important to be quite critical as well of a fixation on social mobility and upward mobility as the main thing that we should be worried about. I mean, in a sense, it's good to be mindful and to want people's social origins not to be determining of where they end up in society and educationally and occupationally. But if we fixate only on that, we lose sight of the fact that no matter how these unequal rewards are distributed, they're still very unequal rewards, particularly when you think about people's economic conditions as a result of the very stratified society in which we live. So I think even if class isn't destiny, I think we should care about the fact that we have a very stratified class structure with increasingly unequal economic positions within it, and it's increasingly the case that actually being at the bottom of that class structure is a very difficult place to be. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Vicky. Today.
Vicky actually said something very important at the end, and I'm not surprised she did. She said inequality matters, right? Now, inequality is complicated. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you, because I'm a quantitative sociologist as well in a way, but I'm also a bit of a historical sociologist, so I'm going to give you a mix. First of all, very interestingly, the UK is one of only 2 high-income countries by the World Bank measure where the majority of people identify as working class. Self-identification. Identification is interesting. That, to my mind, is entirely a product of our long history as an industrial society. Okay? But the other thing is class position. Now, it's conventionally measured by occupation, although I'm going to bluntly say occupational measures are not much use these days, because the significant unit is a household, and households characteristically of working age tend to have 2 members, but also have something else. They have a certain amount of wealth. And that is very new. Thomas Piketty, in his big book on wealth and capitalism, makes the point that other than in peasant societies, 120 years ago, almost nobody had any wealth except the wealthy, right? Working class people in the northeast of England had no wealth whatsoever. Where has this acquisition of wealth come from? It's come from primarily the acquisition of housing, okay? So there's a distribution of wealth, which of course itself is massively unequal, and the very, very rich have most of the wealth, especially most of the financial wealth, but lots of ordinary people have some wealth, okay? And Max Weber talked about class in terms of life chances and your ability to engage in market relations on the basis of your resources. And resources now are a combination of income and wealth. And what do you want to do if you want to really have a good life in the near future? You want to be like the Chinese students that I used to teach. 4, 2, 1. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child, and inherit all their wealth, okay, right? Especially if they lived in London. That would be a real asset, okay? That is a really important thing, because there was more social mobility into that kind of category of person. People who have a secure life because they had a house, they had a job, and they had a pension, right? Particularly in what the Marxist historian Hobsbawm called the fortunate third quarter of the 20th century, the period immediately after the Second World War. So I'm going to tell you a bit of family history. I am one of 13 grandchildren of an illiterate Irish coal miner, okay, in County Durham, right? Not a poor man, because he was a coal miner. He was a pitman. He was in the top dollar job, okay? 9 of us are graduates. One of who wasn't a graduate, but who started as a junior reporter on a newspaper at the age of 16, is actually the wealthy of us. He even owns a couple of racehorses now, because he went into local radio and then into public relations and made a lot of money. Okay, he's actually a very nice guy. I actually get on with him very well. What were the rest of us? Most of us were public sector workers. My father was the first one to go to university. My life connection with Durham University goes back 76 years, because I was actually born when my father was a student at King's College of the University of Durham, now the University of Newcastle. If you think there were a lot of teenage parents around then, there weren't. My father's route from Harton Pit to Newcastle King's College had taken him by way of attempting to participate in the Spanish Civil War, participating in the Second World War, serving at the siege of Tobruk, serving at the Battle of El Alamein, and getting a post-war scholarship to go to university. My parents' marriage didn't last 10 minutes. My daughters worked out I was conceived on their honeymoon, right? And there's another thing I'm bringing in, because my mother, who had left school at 15, had entered the civil service as a junior tax officer by passing exams, had been promoted up into the executive grades, was hit with a marriage bar on marrying in 1946 and had to give up her job as a pretty well-paid civil servant when I was born, and then retrained as a school teacher. Okay? So I was brought up essentially on my mother's wages. My mother had terrible taste in men, my father and my stepfather, both of them. Okay? But that was an era of mobility where there were other channels. My partner's father started as a fitter in the Rosyth Navy dockyard, was promoted to a torpedo officer, not in the Navy, but he was the guy who handled all the torpedoes that were handed out from the dockyard in Gibraltar through the war, became a manager subsequently, right? These avenues of mobility are now largely gone. Okay, they were very, very important avenues of mobility. The other thing that's gone, and this is the bad news for you poor kids, is security, right? There's massive intergenerational inequality, which is based around the difficulty of obtaining the level of security that existed in the past. Occupational pensions have largely disappeared in the private sector. They're under enormous assault in the public sector. The ability to acquire housing, stay in the northeast, it's the cheapest place, right? Okay, but even there, it's not that cheap, right? I've been an owner-occupier since I was 23 years old. I've traded up over the years to the point where I lead a very pleasant life in the Scottish borders, which is a relatively cheap place to buy a nice country cottage, by the way, so there's another tip for you. What's coming down the pike, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation are very worried about what they call the squeezed middle, which they define as households with between 80% and 200% of the median household income in their society. They're worried about them being squeezed, but even more about the inability to pass on that middle security to their children. Yeah, that's what's coming. And then there's global warming. So if I was you, I would rapidly acquire, first of all, a bladed weapon, okay? And second, a set of practical skills that will enable you to survive come Armageddon. Right? Okay? But I'm only partly joking in that respect, I have to say. I'm writing a book on crisis at the minute, and it's driving me, it's giving me nightmares. Okay? But what we saw was a lot of what's called relative social mobility, because the social structure changed. There were lots of jobs that emerged for people in all sorts of ways, but we're seeing a closing down of absolute social mobility. Yeah? There is almost no movement down. The difference that exists is between, really, to quote, the 95% and the 5%. Yeah? And that is going to continue to be the case. So in that sense, that's classic Marxism. Class still matters. The ability to move into the relatively comfortable lives of me and my cousins. My brother has actually just been knighted, for God's sake. Okay? Not the one who made a lot of money, he's the one who became Vice-Chancellor. Okay? And he's a doctor as well, so that was up. But this is just a point. I started at university as a medical student. Very large proportion of the people in my first year at Newcastle University in medical school were the children manual workers. Yeah? Will you see that now? No. There were far more manual workers, far more skilled manual workers, far more people with relatively comfortable lifestyles, but the comfortable lifestyle is up for contestation. And you will have to fight for it if you want to have it.
Fantastic, thank you, David. I was not expecting such practical advice. If you possess yourself with a bladed weapon, please don't bring it into college.
Pretend it's a gardening tool.
We're going to hear next from Lindsay.
So, as you can tell, I am the antithesis of the typical Durham student. I'm not rich, I'm not from the south, and I don't have rich parents. I am a mature student. I have a 15-year-old son who is much closer in age than me to most of my peers within my year. And I always say I got into Durham by chance. I didn't get into Durham by chance. I got into Durham by sheer hard work. So a little bit of a backstory. Myself and my sister, who's just sitting over there, who also works for here for Van Mildert, so you're very lucky to have her. I don't have to put up with her all the time. Our mother died in 2019, so everything kind of changed, and obviously death is a huge part of that. And the reason I decided, after being a gifted and talented student, and went into a mentorship with a solicitor at school and was predicted to do high things, I decided I was going to ship myself off to London at 18, do whatever I wanted, then ended up pregnant, had my son at 19. So I was a teenage parent, and I live in a council estate, so I don't fit the bill whatsoever. I decided in 2020, after our mother died, that I needed to do something. So I went into access to higher education, which is essentially A-levels condensed into very short 8 months, and a lot of stress whilst working part-time as well, as a single parent with a chronic illness. So I'd made the choice, and so I think, Destiny, your class is a series of choices. I will choose to either get my education and deal with all the stress and the anxiety and having to deal with my son doing his GCSEs as I'm at university and all the other stuff, or stay where I am and not have a decent pension and not be able to help my son buy his first property, not be able to help him buy a car, for him to have the same issues that I have, because as obviously my delightful learned panellists will tell you, obviously health and wealth is dramatically interconnected, and if you have low social mobility, you will most definitely have a lower life expectancy. I don't want that. I want to be annoying my son till I'm well into my 90s. I've earned it. I put up with all the annoying little things he would say, like he once said on a bus, completely packed, got on the bus and we had to walk to the back because I didn't drive at the time because I hadn't decided I needed to go into education. And there was a lovely gentleman at the back who had an eye patch and was clearly a veteran because he had one leg. My son sat down, and you can imagine he was 2. Look, Mum, there's a pirate. And I wanted the world to swallow me whole, so I fully earned every cake that I am very apt at baking. I'm forcing it upon my grandchildren and letting him deal with the consequences and him deal with the horrible questions and the, why is the sky blue? What did Jesus eat for his last meal? Question at 7:30 in the morning. So I don't think it is, and I don't think it's a popular opinion to have, but yes, I was born in a council estate. I've lived in a council estate my entire 34, nearly 35 years, but I don't intend to stay in a council estate. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you choose to stay where you are and you're comfortable and you have the option to retire with enough money to be comfortable, that's fine. Everyone wants to be an academic, and everyone wants to be a bin man. Everyone wants to be a builder or any of those things. Everyone has a different option. But it's important that you take responsibility for your choices. I'm taking responsibility for my choices and doing the hard thing, doing everything backwards. So please don't have children when you're 18 or 19. Wait a little bit until you've, gained your degree and got some better salary under your belt rather than £22,000. It's a series of choices. And if you choose to not do something about it, I'm very much of the opinion that you've kind of chosen to stay where you are, whether that's a confidence thing or you don't believe you belong here. Because a lot of people said to me when I said I applied to Durham, as someone from Durham, why would you go there? It's full of posh kids. You're not supposed to be there. And it kind of made me feel a little bit guilty. And I didn't expect to get the grades, but I actually got 4 distinctions at my access. And I was offered a low entry qualification through UCAS, but I didn't need it. And that wasn't luck, that wasn't anything else but sheer hard work. So it's entirely up to you. If you want to move up in social class, then you have to take that choice and take that fight and that drive and push yourself there so you can show your children, because my son now knows at 15, you don't get anywhere without a degree or degree level qualification if you don't want to do traditional university, because there are obviously other options. Like I said, everyone wants to be a teacher or, you might want to do something else. We need lots of different people to keep the country and the world going. So you do what you are passionate about and try and make it so that you are comfortable enough to exist and you can help anyone else who needs help, because I'm fully aware that once, hopefully, touch wood, knock on wood, I earn enough money, I can drag my sister kicking and screaming with me on holidays and help her buy a house and do those things, because that's what I'm supposed to do. You're supposed to better yourself so you can help other people better themselves and give back to the community that you're in, whether that's at university or in your hometown or wherever you are.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'm going to come back up here and reoccupy the podium, but the floor is now open to questions. And so think of your questions, stick your hand up, and Calypso will come and find you with the microphone. While you're thinking, I'll start. So I was really interested in the way you discuss different kinds of markers of class. Education, occupation, income are all class markers. Where you go on holiday, how often you go on holiday, whether you go skiing, whether you play golf, what kind of car you drive. These are all kind of, important class markers. But you also talked about the limits of those, right? And one of the things I'm interested to hear more about is the psychological tenacity of class. That even if you are relatively mobile in terms of those kinds of external class markers, my sense of class and my experience of class is that class doesn't leave you. And no matter how mobile you may be, no matter how much your social circle may change, no matter how much your financial, your economic circumstances, your professional circumstances may change. So I wondered if you could say anything about that.
Shall I start?
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's true that there used to be quite a fashion for sociological studies of how upwardly mobile people actually were quite psychologically traumatized by their social mobility and felt that they didn't really fit in the new social milieu where they were located, nor did they really properly fit in their communities of origin. And I think your class upbringing definitely does follow you as a kind of key aspect of your identity, and you can often feel that identity is in conflict with how your identity has evolved over time. I think for the upwardly socially mobile, one of the big issues is that often the attributes that you have and the characteristics that you have that are linked to your class of origin are in the popular culture kind of denigrated. So if you take, for example, having a regional accent rather than a received pronunciation accent, it's often seen as making you lesser somehow, isn't it? And I remember I used to have a very strong Birmingham accent, and I lost it during the course of my university studies. And at the time I was quite pleased because I knew that it was marking me out as dumb, really. It was the suggestion of having a Brummie accent. But I feel quite sad about that now, because that is actually part of my roots and my heritage, and isn't something that is inferior to the way that I speak now. I'm smiling because there's a couple of occasions here particularly where people have asked me where I'm from, and say I don't sound like someone from Durham, and I'm a Durham local, so I am from Durham. But what you were saying about people kind of having that conflict, I think you almost feel a little bit, the people who I know who have gotten a better education or managed to get themselves in a better financial situation often feel a little bit conflicted, because the friends that they have from working class background might necessarily be able to afford the things they want to do, or they don't want to say, oh, I'm doing this, or why can't you do it, kind of thing. But you definitely do want to hold on to those working class roots, because it's who you are, and you don't want to feel as if you're trying to say I'm better than you now. It's kind of like I'm still working class, but you've got like 3 times as much money. It's a conflict, but it's important. I think you just have to obviously process that yourself, and have the tenacity to say, yes, I am from a working class background, but I have tried to better myself and not for a greedy sense, kind of, if that makes sense.
It's a really complicated business. I mean, I have a Geordie accent, and I can talk Geordie if I want to, right? And I do really. My partner, who's Scots, and again has a Scots accent, says that we both adjust our accents to the people we are with. So I, generally speaking, speak in a rather, what, posh Geordie, okay? Just like my brother, who was taken out to Australia at the age of 16, the one who's just been knighted, he still is a post-Geordie. Okay, and it's interesting because I think there was the northeast of England was a place where working class people had a lot of money, right? In the pits, on the shipyards, on the sea, and that was still true in my life, in my adult life. I had a lot of friends who worked in a job called laggers, thermal insulation workers. I knew them because I knew some of them from the Scouts back in the day. And they earned a lot of money at particular points in time. There was one point in the 1980s where they'd realised they were the last on big construction jobs on Orkney to do with oil. And if they went on strike, the penalty clauses kicked in. And this is in the 1980s, and they were on £1,000 a week, right? Okay. Now, that was very particular, very specific, and not for very long, right? But it was a time when working class people had quite a lot of money in their hands, yeah? That was the 1960s and the 1970s. Those were the good years, okay? And that was what my world as a young adult. I think it's very, very different for people of your age, yeah? I think Vicky's younger than my oldest child. Right? Yeah, you are, because you're not 50. She's 53.
We'll say I am.
Yeah. But it's a different world because there's been more of a division. That relatively prosperous earning money working class from two household incomes, often in the northeast, for example, a woman working in a light engineering factory or the clothing factory and a man in a skilled manual job, has virtually disappeared. Right? The division there has become much sharper. Most of the people I knew when I was a kid lived in council houses. Right? My mother would have killed for a council house, I think. She eventually had to buy one. It was harder to get a council house as a single parent. Yeah? Council housing was where people had a secure life and had good jobs. My friend of mine who's just retired as a professor of microbiology at UCL, his dad was a cop and he lived in a council house. Yeah, that divide has so much opened up within what I would call, by position, a working class. Yeah, and it is really one of the big problems that we have. So, for example, the great big estates like Marsden Estate in South Shields, both of you had to have been in the forces and have the points to get a house there in 1947. Yeah, that was a different world. And I think it's important to grasp the quality of that world. If you want to get some idea of it, watch old editions of Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. Because that's exactly about that division emerging, and it does it very well.
Nobody here's got any idea what you're talking about when you say that, David. But
you can find it on iPlayer.
So one thing that's really interesting there is that idea that class isn't about money. Or isn't only about money, that if once you know how much money somebody has, that is not necessarily the key to understanding their class identity. I find that a really interesting idea. Okay, questions or comments or thoughts or, Bakey first of all, and then lots more.
Hi there. My question is is there a danger in accepting this thesis and does it lead us to accepting that we have no control to where we end up in our lives? So to add on to that, if we accept class as our destiny, does that render personal responsibility and personal might less? For example, I think of my mother from Holyhead, who went to Holyhead High School. Holyhead's not the most prosperous place, never mind in Wales, but in the UK. And the done thing was not to do A-levels, and you would stay in Holyhead, and you stay in Holyhead your whole lives. And she achieved 3 C's at her A-levels, which were by far the best in her school, and she had to fight really hard to become that first generation scholar. My concern is if we accept that class is destiny, people like my mother would be destined to stay in Holyhead and not have that fight for upward social mobility. That's my question.
It's a fair comment.
And Lindsay's given us a really kind of robust defence of that idea that you can take your destiny into your own hands, and that you make a choice to do that. At the same time, we've also heard from Vicky that class mobility is tends to be short range, that you tend not to go up more than 1 or 2 classes in the government 7-class structure. So any thoughts on that? How do we understand the relationship between class and individual agency?
You want to pass me that? Very good point. Absolutely right. Except the only and when we say it's not, the word determine is a good one. It can mean if this, then exactly that, or if it means if this, then there's a range of possibilities, of bounded possibilities. And I always try and use it in the second sense. The only thing I will say is that I think any kind of social mobility was much easier 40 years ago than it is now. Yeah? And yes, you can aspire. And if you're sitting in this room, you have already made important moves if you came from a background that was other than a secure middle class background to start off with. Yeah? The only thing I'm worried about is even those of you who come from a secure middle class background are going to have a hell of a job to hang on to it. Right? But it will be a matter of individual and collective decisions, okay, about what you're going to get, about how you're going to actually establish your position in the world. And some of that will be individual through aspiration and other things, and some of it will be collective, as you may have noticed with your teachers who are regularly on strike at this particular point in time.
That's a lovely point. I'm going to, unless anyone else is keen to come in, I'm going to move on and hear from Isabel next. Just wait for the mic.
Hi. How significant is private versus state school education in preparing students for those high-level jobs that you're talking about, and how does that impact the upward mobility of state school students?
Networks.
Yeah, I think you can't underestimate actually the importance of that subset of the middle/upper class that is privately educated, particularly from the really expensive, well-known fee-paying schools. I think it's the Social Mobility Commission and the Sutton Trust produce an elitist Britain report every year or two, and they tell you what proportion of people in the most powerful and senior positions in society went to Oxbridge and are from private schools. And both the private school contingent and the Oxbridge contingent of things like the senior judiciary, senior journalists, politicians, CEOs, etc., are massively disproportionately drawn from those groups, from those who went to expensive schools, on through to through Oxbridge, usually Oxford rather than Oxbridge. Cambridge, not so much.
She tells she's an Oxbridge graduate.
I went to both, so I kind of hedged my bets a little bit, just in case. But yeah, I think it's hugely important, and I think it's really important to disaggregate what we mean by middle class, actually, because there's the sort of people who are broadly affluent and in professional, quite autonomous, secure jobs, and then there's the really, really, really elite, powerful people who have a lot of sway over what actually happens to the rest of us. So yeah, I think it's a really important distinction to make.
I think there's another thing that's really interesting there that you're sort of touching on is the because of the exponential distribution of wealth, right? So the further up you go, the further you have to go to get to the next percentile. And what that means is that even people who, by any objective measure, are at the top of the curve, still often feel poor because they know people who are much richer than them, right? And so there's a really interesting thing about perception of class position, as well as subjective perception of your own wealth, having just said wealth is not the same as class, I think kind of skews this debate in interesting ways, right? And you were saying that most people identify as working class in this country, but it's very hard to find people who identify as upper class, including those who, by any objective measure, must surely be upper class.
Very good point. The sociological term for that is relative deprivation. Right? Who you compare yourself with and how you think. It's interesting to see that a lot of people in what you might call the concierge class, people who are lawyers, accountants, who have really high incomes, but because they work with the very, very rich, yeah, there's research on this, good research on this, themselves feel relatively poor, yeah. In other words, they can't afford a yacht, yeah, and you can see that as a real issue in a particular level of the social order, yeah.
I remember reading an article in the paper where they had gone to interview a number of people who were in the top 1% of earners. At that time, I think to be in the top 1% of earners, you had to earn about £140,000 a year. It'd be a bit higher now. And all of them said, well, I'm not really rich, because I know there are these other people who go to the same, parents at my kids' school, and they're rich because they can, do what they have more. And it was about disparities in inherited wealth, right? That actually salary is becoming much less important as a marker of wealth. But it was also to do with this kind of exponential, as you say, relative deprivation, which, interestingly skews this debate. Right, more questions. This lady here first.
Here. Kathy.
Kathy, thank you.
Hi, Kathy Bader, and you can tell right away that I'm from the United States. I've been a Van Mildert student and a mentor now since 2014. And I'm interested in the intersection of two things we haven't talked about much yet. One of which doesn't exist at all in the United States, and one which is very pervasive in the United States. And that's what we would call, but I'm not actually sure what you would call, nobility, and then race. And so I'm interested in your thoughts of the intersection of that. Is if you have a title of sir, except for your brother, you did mention him, title of sir, are you immediately in the upper class, whether you're rich or not? And do you feel that, of course, in the United States, it's a huge issue in terms of earnings and wealth and accumulated wealth, and the vision there is, the myth of the American dream has definitely disappeared as we've realized that, all the members of the Supreme Court graduated from Harvard or Yale. That's it. And so I'm interested in those topics, and I didn't frame it terribly well, but
it's a good
if
point.
you could speak to that, I would appreciate it.
By the way, my brother has gone back to Australia, so he doesn't dare use his title. But it's interesting because the concept, one of the differences between the British aristocracy and the French aristocracy was that the British aristocracy could be accessed over a long period of time through wealth. But it's interesting that the Duke of Westminster, whose surname is Grosvenor, which Grovenier means the fat hunter, once said that the best way to be wealthy in Britain was to have been descended from a close personal friend of William the Conqueror. Okay, right? So there is that. But extreme wealth, you can see the people who were the great industrial capitalists of the 19th century who have become part of the nominal nobility, as well. And, wealth works as it always has. And what is interesting now is that there are new sources of wealth, particularly from financial speculation, which enable people to access that kind of lifestyle in the same way, And also, I think, the globalization. That if you look at the number of extraordinarily wealthy people of South Asian origin, both South Asian and East Asian origin, who have penetrated into the elite of British society, the present Prime Minister and his wife being good examples of it, that it operates in that way. There's a kind of way, I live in the Scottish borders where you can't move without falling over a duke, okay? Really, I'm not joking about that, right? There's about 6 of them, okay? And it's interesting that how people regard them. The Douglas Humes, who were the earls of, who are ancient aristocracy, are all well liked because they're very amiable, right? It's interesting that how you present yourself with others matters, whereas some of the others are detested because they're not amiable. Right? So, your personal style operates quite well in relation to that. And there's a general feeling that new money is not amiable in the way that the really good old money is amiable.
How about race? Anyone want to pick that up?
Well, go on, talk about interaction. She's a quantitative sociologist.
I don't really know what to say about it. I mean, I think it's not as correlated with class. Race is not as correlated with class in the UK as it is in the US, for sure. But I think it's still the case that when you look at educational mobility, there is a statistical interaction between class and race, in particular such that being middle class actually is not as much of a protection for you in terms of doing well in school and moving on to university and elite universities if you're black or Asian as if you're white. So there is something going on there, but it's not nearly as pronounced as an issue as it would be in the US, I would say.
Although it's interesting, in the US, there's an emergent black, very affluent population. Yeah. While I think what Vicky said was broadly right, there are even differentiations there. There's a big difference between being Indian and Pakistani in the UK. Yeah, because a lot of the Indian people are of middle class, came as middle class people, doctors, pharmacists, so on. And often pass on that. I mean, Sunak is the child of a doctor and a pharmacist. Yeah, but also you'll see the very high percentage of people of Indian origin in UK medical schools, yeah, because they're the children of doctors. It was ever thus, yeah, but it's a complicated interrelationship. For example, people of Mirpuri Pakistani origin or Bangladeshi origin, generally speaking, are much less affluent within the UK. So it's a highly differentiated structure. Even within the black population, there's a clear difference between Afro-Caribbean and more recent African immigrants to the advantage of the latter. Yeah, which is interesting.
Right, Brian first. I'd like your thoughts on two things. The first relates to barriers, and I wonder what you think about social skills being a serious barrier. I remember my first days at a rather well-known university down in the south of England, and it was pretty traumatic. So those social skills I have learned. The second thing I wonder is, we've talked about mobility in terms of this sort of abstract concept, but what about physical mobility? How important is it to move physically somewhere else, out of your own environment? And is the barrier of losing your friends a serious one? I'm rather conscious that I have very close relations with my college friends, but I have no contact with my school friends, one of whom has served time for murder. So I just wonder whether those two things, which I think are somewhat related,
Speak on the barriers.
is something you might like to have a...
So in relation to the barriers, myself, obviously, as a mature student, I feel like the funny old lady in the corner. No one wants to talk to me, no one wants me in the seminar group, so it makes it incredibly difficult to do the work. And I actually nearly left last year because of that. And I do still feel like the old fuddy-duddy in the corner that no one wants to talk to, but that's fine. I have my own skill set, I have my own knowledge, and I can bring different things as to what other people in the room could bring, and I fully accept that it's very important to have those different viewpoints. So for me to come here was an active choice to put myself in situations I don't feel I belong. And I do belong because I've earned the right to be here, I've done the work, I do the work, I continue to do the work despite everything I have to do outside of university. So it is hard, but you do have to separate your social circles. But I think we do that anyway as you grow up, as you change where you go for work, where you change jobs, and you find a new friend that you've found through a hobby, etc. I have very different friends at Durham University who I've met at Durham University than I do from my home background or from work or just friends in general, and they don't intersect at any point. And I'm okay with that because it means I can switch off from university. I can have time away from it. It's not a constant worry because it is obviously a pressure and anxiety on me to do well because I am the breadwinner. It's important to have that cross section of people who you can go to for different things obviously in a healthy way, not in a I need you for this kind of way. But yeah, that's my viewpoint, and obviously I can't really speak on the other the other part of it, but I'm sure my panellists will be on that.
There's an interesting, the concept of social capital is really interesting here, because one of the key things which I think Vicky really strongly implied, but I'm going to make explicit, is that people who are privately educated and go to very elite universities have linkages, have connections, have all kinds of connections, which are positive social capital. But there's an argument that actually people often have negative social capital, in the sense that, and I find this a very dangerous argument, but it is made, that because they have connections in their own place which offer them resources and support in all sort of way, they will not break out of that. Yeah? Now, it's a dangerous argument, and I find it a difficult one, and yet there is a slight element of truth in it. Yeah? There's more truth in it now, I think, because of this separation that exists, within working class people, between people who live now on council estates and people who now live in owner-occupied areas, which did not used to exist. Yeah? One of my PhD students looked at studies in Sunderland in the 1950s, when the builders who were building a big new estate were advertising it to affluent working class tenants, saying, come and live by one of my houses, it'll be a real asset. That was a true advert if ever there was one. Yeah?
They're still doing that now, David. I worked for Gentoo Homes, a part of Gentoo Group, and the uproar, because we built an estate in Pennywell after a site got demolished, right next to council houses, and the amount of people who said, I'll have that house, but I won't have that house, because that's closer to the council houses. So it still happens. It's just people don't want to be seen to be saying, I don't want to live next to those people. It's just a quiet, I can choose a better house on the site rather than that.
But that back then, that was not about that, right? I mean, I was at school in Sunderland, so I know Pennywell quite well. And Pennywell was a perfectly ordinary place. People who were at grammar school with me, who went on to have professions, were from Pennywell. Yeah, that was an interesting period, as I say. It's this way of closing in on things, right? Now, geographical mobility, I came back to the Northeast purely by accident, because the first job I got when I was applying for jobs as a graduate student at the LSE was Durham. Yeah, and I've only ever moved once, which was to go and work in Northern Ireland in Belfast in the 1970s, which I actually loved.
But
right?
you'd already been away to university?
I hadn't been away to university. I went to Newcastle University.
Okay.
Yeah, I went up on the bus half the time. Okay, I lived, which was incredibly common, yeah, back in those days, and was very common in Scottish universities and in red brick universities generally. Okay, I eventually started moving out and living in all sorts of weird places in the West End of Newcastle, but there was much more linkage. You didn't necessarily move to go away.
What do you make of this idea then that the big divide in Britain now is between the somewheres and the anywheres, between those people who are very rooted and those people who tend to be more mobile?
I think it's a somewhat false distinction. It's interesting to look at the students at Northumbria University, okay, including students who are doing degrees which will guarantee them jobs in health, in IT, and in various focused professions. They tend to be local. A lot of them tend to live at home. There was a PhD student of mine, Andreas Jatsianglu, who is a Greek name, but he's a Morpeth boy, who did a study in Ashington and found there were very large numbers of people who'd lived at home and gone to Northumbria. I think you would find the same at a lot of the post-92 universities. It's different niches within the system. The biggest problem, which a lot of you will have if you try to move to London, is how the hell will you be able to afford to live there? Yeah? This is one of the aspects which has changed. When I was at the LSE, I lodged with an old Jewish tailor in Hackney, and I was up for a job at Northumberland and Polly, and I got the Durham job first. And my landlord, who was a very nice man I got on with very well, said, David, my boy, buy the house next door. And if I had bought it next door, I'd be a multimillionaire now. Right? And it's as absurd and arbitrary as that in many respects.
Question from Rebecca.
I'm Rebecca, I'm the chaplain here, and prior to this I was chaplain at HMP Durham. I've worked at a couple of prisons. I'm interested because we're talking a lot about, you know, aspiring and moving up, but when I was in prison chaplaincy, I met very few people who would identify as middle class. The majority of people I met would identify as working class. And even fewer, a handful of people who'd been to university, and they tended to be in for fraud.
No surprise there.
Come to university, learn how to commit better crimes.
But I'm interested in the kind of class and prison, you know, the kind of prison to school, school to prison pathway that so many of the men, because I worked in men's prison, so many of the men seem to have been really trapped in, even if they were, you know, would have been bright enough or would have wanted to study or learn.
Had many of them been in the forces?
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still true, but at one point there was a statistic that in certain parts of Britain, if you were born a black man, you were more likely to go to prison than to go to university.
Still true.
Mm-hmm. Still true in the States. The reason I asked about the forces is an interesting one, because the forces can be a good route to social mobility, but they can also be a big disadvantage. I have often recommended young people to get into the technical branches of the forces in the RAF or the Navy or in the REME, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, on the grounds that way they will acquire a good skill set which is marketable in the world today. Yeah? And it does work. But then there are lots of other people who go into the forces because they have no alternative. And actually the RAF and the Navy and the REME are terribly picky about who they will take. Right? They really look for you to have good academic qualifications at the age of 16 at the very minimal. So there are different routes that work out. But that route, the forces, was actually historically a good route to a certain kind of social mobility. I know guys who run their own businesses on Teesside who started off as a Royal Navy artificer engineer, yeah, and made very good life out of it.
It tended to be the staff that were ex-forces much more often than the prisoners.
Ah, well, that figures. Yeah.
Simon. Oh, thank you. Yes, so this is maybe one more for Lindsay and Vicky. Given David has demonstrated so much the importance of education, and as you all have particular kinds of education as a route for social mobility, are there steps that self-identifiedly elite universities such as Durham should be taking, meaningful steps, in order to make experiences such as yours less untypical? No, nice, easy one.
Do you want me to go first? Give you some time to think.
I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, in the time that I've been at Durham, which is about 10, 12 years, it's got a bit better than it was originally, and I think there's been a bit of a culture shift, I would say, actually, towards genuinely caring about having greater socioeconomic diversity within the student body, and less fear about upsetting the independent school headmasters conference loft. And one of the really important things that Durham's embraced is contextualised admissions, and I'm a big advocate of that. A lot of my work illustrates the need for contextual admissions, and this is basically where we don't pretend that someone's A-level grades are an objective, neutral indicator of what they're capable of, but we recognise that very different inputs have gone into realising those grades, right? And so, for someone who had an expensive private school education, have got graduate parents, affluent family, they've done really well to get those 3A stars or whatever the new grade system is. But if you look at someone who's from a free school meals background, low family income, struggling school, no sixth form, etc., then a bunch of Bs at A-level puts them in the top 1% of performers for people in their circumstances. And I think Durham has done a lot in the time that I've been here to move towards recognising that in its admissions criteria, and hopefully it'll get bolder as we go as well.
Yeah, so I think, as I say, I was offered essentially a contextual, if I can say the word, admission because of my age, my economic background, and obviously me being a local person from Durham. I was offered the lower grades to get in. I worked hard enough to get without that at all. But just to be transparent, I obviously do get a full student loan, maintenance loan, and I also get a very generous bursary from the university automatically. So it's not you have to apply for it, you don't have to fight for it. It's delivered on the basis of the information delivered from Student Finance England. So that essentially gives me an extra £2,500 a year, and that was increased this year from last year. So although that doesn't cover all my bills, that's difficult for anyone at the moment to live on roughly £11,000 a year. It doesn't cover that, but that goes a long way to help me feel a lot more comfortable with that. And obviously with today's news as well, a lot of students, I think it's something like 40% of students have to take on part-time work to be able to afford to live because their maintenance loan is taken up by their rent. That is obviously an issue, but that's a wider issue. And obviously as a university, there is a massive sway in that. It's very important for the local economy, but also it's kind of like a cash grab for landlords. My background is property, so I'm unfortunately going to be one of those horrible cash grabbing landlords at some point. So I understand why, but it is important for people to understand you do actually have to live, and I do have to work. I do 2 very long days around university, and Van Mildert has helped me, and the business school are very helpful with making sure I can do those 2 full days with 3 days at university dedicated, so I can still provide for my son, who we can still afford. He can go to the cinema this weekend without me thinking, oh no, can we eat next week? So it is, and I was very surprised that is actually more generous than local colleges. So for example, New College, my friend does the exact same business degree at New College, and she gets nowhere near as much bursary as me, and nowhere near as much help, despite there being only 6 people on her degree course, and there's over 300 on mine. So I don't know if that's any help or I can sing my praises a lot, and a lot of people say it is really difficult, it's very expensive, but I have had a lot of help, and Durham do take into account your personal circumstances and recognise you're not just a number, you're not just paying the bills, you are actually a part of the community, and it's important that you have a good mental health, and if you can speak to someone, if there's an issue, you can speak to any number of staff at any department, whatever degree course you're doing, there'll be someone you can speak to, and obviously the chaplains will be there to help you if you needed anything as well.
I think that's really encouraging to hear, and I think there is an appetite at Durham for doing more in terms of admissions. I think we still, and I think we've come a long way, and I think we'll go further. I think we probably still have some way to go on what happens after those people get here, right? It's one thing to widen the admissions, it's another to make sure that those people succeed when they arrive. So work still to do, but very good to hear that we're doing some things right. Right. 3 questions. Since Calypso's holding the microphone, I think we better let her ask a question.
How far do you think culture plays a role, or the lifestyle expectations that derive from culture? For example, I'm an international student from Greece, and I think that Greece is culturally classified as a collectivist country, and you do see quite a big gap between the lower working class and the upper working class, and that might be because people might relate to Vicky's question, people might be satisfied with where they are. Basically how far do you think culture plays a role?
It's a complicated question, right? Because culture means so many different things, yeah? There's about access and appreciation of elite culture, okay? Which is often easier to get if you've been privately educated, because, to be blunt about it, so many state schools are under so much pressure that what used to be good cultural opportunities are no longer available. My partner used to regularly, when she was an English teacher, to take children from Scottish comprehensives to the theatre, for example. It doesn't happen now, yeah? And it's better in Scotland than it is here, yeah? So there's all those kinds of things about that. And then there's about cultural identities in the way you go through, yeah? I come from South Shields, a sand dancer background, and we are hard buggers, right? We just have no notion that anybody could be any better than any of us. And if you think the men are hard, right, you've never met the women. That's all I can say, yeah? It is, and that is actually a degree of confidence that came from being part of a high income, high wage, very highly organised working class culture, yeah? And actually I used to know people in the Greek Seamen's Union, and they were exactly like that, in the same photo frame. So there are different ways in which culture plays out, yeah? But it's interesting. By the way, I just had to think, because when we were talking about Durham, which I think Durham is doing quite a good job, my partner, who was assistant head of a large Scottish comprehensive in Fife, hates and loathes St Andrews, right? Wow. That's partly because she's an Edinburgh graduate, but it's also because the one kind of person that you never see in St Andrews is a working class person from a Fife comprehensive, yeah? And St Andrews makes Durham, look like a paragon of all the virtues.
All right. 3 questions here, so we'll go for this gentleman first, and then Lulu, and then David.
I'm Andy, and I'm a police officer. I was educated here at Durham 20 years ago, and I studied modern languages. I don't use my trade at the moment beyond the use of communication. And it's one of those things where I've noticed, and we've already spoken about this tonight, about how you speak to people, how you've changed your voice. People would say to me, "Oh, you don't sound like you're a Darlington boy. You sound like you're from somewhere down south." But I will tailor how I speak to people. I'll listen and I'll try and recreate that noise to try and fit in there. Now, in the police force, we're seeing that we're moving away from hiring anyone who can, well, not break a pencil and write their own name correctly, to those who are now exclusively degree-based entry. So we've got some who are direct entry from management positions to higher levels of rank, having never served a day on the front line of the line, as we've seen with armed forces officers. Are we going to see an impact and a noticeable loss from looking to obtain people from a higher status background, where we are excluding those people who have lived and are the street monsters that we need to put doors in and talk to the people who will use rather fruity terms for those sent to serve and protect? Are we going to see the negative side of social escalation?
Go on.
I think you've answered your own question, haven't you? I mean, I've already said that the people who are policed the most heavily are working class people. Yeah. There's a good chance that will actually be magnified if the Bobby on the beat is someone who has no connection or understanding of that world, right? So I think, yeah, it's a crazy thing to do to make it a graduate only occupation. And I guess there are many occupations that have become graduate only that don't really need to be graduate, or actually it's detrimental to the nature of that occupation that it is graduate only.
And then so that cuts off routes to social mobility. This is part of your point. Yeah.
It's a bit like social work in a way. I was very, very unhappy with the introduction of undergraduate social work degrees and admitting people at 18. Yeah. My view is that the police should never recruit anybody under the age of 25, yeah? They've had to have acquired some kind of life experience, and social work being exactly the same, have some kind of life experience. A lot of the people I know with degrees who've gone into the cops have been people who've done sports degrees. So you're getting your monsters who can put the doors in, right? That's all right. But the idea that some life experience, this is why experience in the forces, right? My friend Mike Wilson's dad had been a boy seaman and then served through the Second World War before he became a cop, right? It's a life experience which puts you in a place of a position. And I think in some ways this is one of the problems, that there are occupations like police and social work where life experience of whatever kind should be a basis of recruitment.
Okay, go to Lulu. No? Or David first?
Right. So my question is kind of related to the previous one. There was a lot of talk earlier about the history of like social mobility, and I was wondering if like this introduction of the need for degrees in all of these occupations and the disappearance of like high-paying, low university requirement jobs is impacting this. For example, my grandfather was orphaned at 6. He couldn't speak the language of our country, and then he went on to do a 1-year degree in accounting, half of which was Marxist philosophy. And he became the second accountant in our country. So he lived a quite comfortable life, whereas my brother, who went to Cambridge doing economics, he went back for his master's there. He lives a comfortable life by all means, but he still could not achieve the same success as my grandfather, having done a 1-year course. And I guess that would kind of be my question.
People my age who wanted to be accountants didn't go to university. They left at 16 and became article clerks and took part-time exams. And bluntly, if you want to be an accountant, you should have done that. Because what you should have done is left at 18 and got a modern apprenticeship as an accountancy technician and earned a wage and acquired no student debt. And student debt is one of the big issues that hangs around about access to, to life and where you go on. Earned a wage, and when you complete your accountancy technician degrees, you can start taking accountancy exams. Yeah? And I see people do that now. Okay? People would have, a lot of graduates will struggle to get the job that my mother got at 16 with school certificate. Yeah? It is a reality. We have an enormous overproduction of graduates in all kinds of ways. We have an enormous overproduction of PhDs, for example. Yeah? One of the first things I say to a lot of the people I see doing PhDs is think about something other than being an academic, because it's a shit job now. It used to be quite a good job. But think about what are the other things that you can do with your PhD in all sorts of ways. Yeah? So I think that is a really true thing. Yeah? That there were all sorts of routes. You could go to sea as just serve your time as a fitter, go to sea as an uncertificate engineer, end up as a chief engineer earning a bloody fortune. Yeah? All those kinds of things have largely disappeared from our social order, and there are sets of questions that exist around it. But of course, we are often the children of the people who did that. Even I am, yeah, let alone other people. The children of the people who made those moves using that kind of technique. And by the way, in Poland, the faculties of economics, which have been taken out of the universities to teach Marxist economics, changed overnight into business schools with essentially the same staff.
I guess I would just add that one of the perverse things about the massive expansion of higher education, which should be a good thing, right? Like more than 50% of young people now go to university. How can that not be a good thing? Is what Dave said about the sort of oversupply of graduates, as it were. Because I think it's now kind of necessary to go to university if you want any hope of a good life, right? But it's while it's necessary nowadays, it's not sufficient. It's not going to guarantee you that job, but if you don't get a degree, you're really, really unlikely to get it, right? So it's putting a lot of people in a position where they have to, especially when you're paying the kind of fees and the associated costs of doing an undergraduate degree in the UK, it's an extremely big and unethical financial gamble to ask many people to make.
I'm a computer science student, so I was just wondering about two things with how class relates to technology. Obviously we had COVID over the last few years, and it was really interesting in the news talking about whether hybrid working and remote working was going to kind of close these kind of economic, sociological divides. In that you don't have to be in London, you can be wherever you are, but also it's more of a strain on resources because then you need a laptop or you need Wi-Fi. So I guess in one sense, technology kind of is just adding something different, but not necessarily like changing it for the better or for the worse. It's just different obstacles. But then also with the kind of old boys networks of private schools and things like Durham Uni has, I was wondering if things like LinkedIn kind of help level the playing field, in that anyone at uni can also tap into all of these old boys networks even if they didn't go themselves, or if it's still making these bubbles that, you know, private school people meet private school people, tap into those networks, and the others don't as much. And I mean, it's quite a big kind of issue, and we're not all sure how technology is going to change our lives. But
it's a really good question. It's very interesting about technology, right? The big disappearing sector in British society is the old industrial middle class that was technology based, but technology based in engineering, mechanical engineering, in areas like that, yeah? And that was an important route for social mobility. But it's interesting to see that if you go to Teesside University and you do a degree in computer science, and Teesside specialises in computer science coders for gaming, yeah, you're going to make a really good income, yeah? That it's interesting to see that niches have developed in certain kinds of ways. But I actually am talking to a woman in Leeds who was trying to put together a book on digital social exclusion, right? And I think that's a really important theme, let alone that it operates in terms of jobs. If you want to claim your damned universal credit, yeah? I used to work as a volunteer in the Scottish Borders for the Citizens Advice Bureau, and most of my time was helping people get past the digital barriers to claim their universal credit. And many of those people, by the way, were workers. Yeah, they weren't unemployed; they were working and having to claim universal credit. The working poor who exist as a category. So I think it's an interesting theme. You might think that the digital world would create a new kind of industrial middle class. And in some ways it has, yeah? It's also created an industrial, enormously wealthy plutocratic group, very rapidly and very fast. But it's interesting to think about how those relations will work out. In Ireland, which I have a lot to do with, and Ireland's economy is very heavily dependent on information technology and information technology jobs, you can see these kinds of patterns beginning to emerge, yeah?
One thing that technology is doing, it seems to me, is scrambling or cutting across some of our existing understandings of class. And, you know, we talked about a little bit how there's now a kind of emergent class of digital workers who are relatively affluent, but who don't necessarily have the same cultural interests as the historical upper middle class, even though they have the economic resources to indulge them. And so there's, you know, there are ways in which these different kind of markers of class are no longer lining up in the way that they have in the past.
Agreed.
Any other thoughts about that?
I know, I obviously think, sorry, in relation to obviously information technology, it is a barrier because you do have to pay the bills, and if you are learning a lower wage despite being in that company, you are at a detriment being further away from the business. And even as a manager, you require 40% more effort to manage a digital team and a work from home team than you do a physical team. So it's a greater impact on the manager. So I think businesses, I'm a work from home employee, but there are days where I'm required to be in the office, and because I'm a boring business student, I eat up all this knowledge and I enjoy that. So businesses don't want you fully remote all the time. It's important to have that connection because it takes a lot more for your manager. It takes a lot. It's a higher impact on a HR team because you could have issues at home and they don't realise it. So, for example, I have to put my camera on even if I look rough as toast, because there could be a safety issue at home. And that's never really been considered. You come into work and people can see your physical you know, how you are. Whereas at home, there could be lots of things going on. There's also an issue around loneliness at home as well when you were a digital worker. Basically, we did a survey at work, and something like 40% of our staff will collar the postman and have him chatting for 20 minutes because you don't talk to anyone. So it is, but I don't think there will be. Everyone thinks. I think a lot of people assume that the work will proceed further and further as work from home, and will, as employees, absorb the cost of running your laptop, running the Wi-Fi, etc. But I don't think that will happen. It's important that we keep that base and that knowledge of your colleagues and what they're capable of and those kind of things. It's important to keep that contact within that world. So I don't think it will be as bad as people think it is, but obviously your business should provide those things. It's not a cost that you should incur. In fact, they should actually be incurring further costs because they should want you to be uply mobile. They should want you to have the skill set and the knowledge to go further within the business and help that business expand and help your colleagues and promote that extra learning and skills within the business.
I visited a co-working space in Leeds a few weeks ago, and that was very interesting because that's a space where there were some businesses renting space there, but a lot of people were individuals and they were renting space there or joining that club so that they could have a space to work. And that was, a broad range of people. But there's a possibility that office space becomes actually something that you have to be quite affluent to buy for yourself in a future of digital working. Right, this could go on for a long time. I know there are questions waiting to be answered, but we are running out of time, so I'm going to take one last question just here.
There's actually kind of two, but I will try and be as quick as I possibly can. First question, my mum works for the NHS in health centres. Recently she was kind of under the umbrella of a private company, but now it's transferred specifically under the NHS. So she had to do a lot of online training again, and sort of like safeguarding fire extinguishers, etc., etc. I think we can all kind of agree that it's not socially acceptable to outright say something rude or ignorant about people's class, but at one point she was answering the questions and it came up, true or false, children from deprived backgrounds will turn to lives of crime. So she put false and apparently got it wrong because according to the NHS, children from deprived backgrounds will definitely turn to lives of crime. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak in the first instance about this more subtle use of languages and assumptions which are quite wrong. And the other part of my question is, I'm a northern working class student from South Shields.
Sound answer.
Exactly. Lindsay, a lot of what you said really, really resonated with me. I feel like we're in a lot of similar circumstances. I'm a mature student, we're very close in age.
Yeah.
I came to education very late because I had a lot of ill health, and then I chose to work for a while. But mainly, I'm studying Japanese, and I have a passion, a great passion for a long time, but it never occurred to me that this was something for me, that I could go to uni and study. And that was never a conscious thought. It was sort of an unconscious bias, prejudice that I had about myself. It was only when I happened to go online and sort of Google Japanese classes just as a hobby, it came and said, study Japanese at Newcastle, study Japanese at Durham. And it changed the trajectory of my life, and now I'm here. So how can we change that, people's internal thoughts, to really grasp the opportunities which are there?
Brilliant. So one question about microaggressions and use of language, one question about the internal class identity and how that may be limiting.
Should I do class identity? So it's obviously it's an instilling it in your children that obviously you can. It's very much like Barbie. You can be anyone. You can do anything, and it is a confidence thing. And within schools, that you need to give that information to kids that. It sounds really cheesy and cliche, but it's true. And as you know, as a mature student, you kind of just lull around for a bit and you do jobs that you don't really enjoy but pay the bills just. And then you get to a point where you kind of you're at like a standstill, and you realise actually I can't do this anymore. I need to do something different to have a different outcome, so my children know that actually there is another opportunity. Just because you're from a council estate, just because you're from a working class background, just because your mum doesn't drive or that you shop at Lidl doesn't make a difference. Again, it's a series of choices that you make, and as parents, as as aunties, uncles, etc., you need to instill that into people around you, and not just kids. You can go to university at any age. You can do that at any point. There's no barrier. It's what's in your head. If you see you can't do it, you can't do it. If you see you can do it, you'll find a way to do it. It might be hard. It'll be more difficult than other people who are from a better background, but you can still do it. You just have to push yourself to get to that point.
Maybe if I could just build on that to say that I think the two questions were actually one question, because it's about the cultural, the common culture and perceptions of what it means to be from a particular class background. And I think basically what's happening there is that there's a conflation of being deprived and low down on the hierarchy economically with being culturally deficient and lesser in cultural terms. And I think that we do internalise those ideas, and it does seep into the language and the representations that we see in training, on TV, etc. And that's something that we definitely want to be pushing back on.
Thank you. So I'm going to draw it to a close there, but thank you all for your participation in tonight's discussion. That was a really lovely conversation to be part of. I'm very grateful to you all for coming and sharing your thoughts and ideas and questions, and I hope that you leave tonight thinking about this topic in more interesting, more sophisticated, more nuanced ways than you did when you arrived. I'm not going to try and sum up, because I think there's I've been trying to make some notes here, but there's too much to try and sum up. But I do want to say a couple of things before we leave. Firstly, can I ask you, just on our water cooler here on your way out, you will see a feedback form. It would be lovely if you could grab the feedback form. There's a QR code on it. I'm looking at Calypso to tell me if I'm wrong about this, but there's a QR code on it. You can scan with your phone and do an online feedback form, or you can also fill out the paper feedback form. And Calypso, what should people do with the paper feedback form? Just leave it here, or?
Yeah, if you have the time to sign it here and then place it on the closest table to the entrance. Otherwise, just scan the QR code on your way out and fill it in your own time.
Fantastic. And I hope that you will come back and join us for more events. On the 7th of November, we have our annual Trust Lecture, which this year will take the form of a public conversation between me and the blockbuster novelist Alexander McCall Smith. So if you, yes, so if you would like to hear Alexander McCall Smith talking about his works, come along on the 7th of November at 7 o'clock. And the next one of these Critical Conversations events will be on the 23rd of November. It is called Do We Live in a Democracy? And we are very fortunate to have Sir John Curtis, Britain's favourite psephologist, coming to talk to us about that question, as well as the chair of the Electoral Reform Association and one of Durham's own professors of politics, as well as always on these occasions, we will have a student speaker joining that discussion as well. So please come along for that. That's the 23rd of November at 7:30 p.m, slightly later than usual. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Before we go, please can I ask you to join me in thanking all of our speakers.